election story. We are launching, which we did with Africa No Filter. And I will, just after I just introduce this briefly, I will also share with you what it looks like. So I'll just present to you and you can see what it looks like. But to get to this guide, so what we did is we went through hundreds of online articles about elections in Africa, articles from local publications, from international publications. We went through almost 800 articles, just seeing how elections are being reported on. We went through hundreds from different countries, and then we also we had focus groups. We had focus groups with journalists. We had focus groups with journalism educators. We had focus groups with civil society. We have focus groups with publishers to try to understand how they're currently reporting on elections, what informs that, and they think the best way to move forward is. And it was really such rich discussions. And as Ndombi said while she was introducing everyone, that she also welcomes the people who are part of the focus groups. I want to say that as well, just in opening, of course, along with our partner African Filter, I want to give a warm welcome to all the journalists, all the civil society people who have, all the educators, everyone who joined us and gave us their time in making this guide a reality. Say that the insights that are inside this guide are really a combination of everything that you guys shared with us, experiences, and everything that we captured through this process. So really that was the process of creating this guide. And we, together with Africa No Filter, really felt that it was important that we create this tool, not just for journalists, by the way. Absolutely, we worked with journalists, but the beauty of this tool is that it's not just for journalists. Everyone who tells stories on elections on the continent can use this and really find value in this. So whether you are a content creator, whether you are a filmmaker, however you tell stories, this is a tool that will help us all. And the issue of telling our stories, particularly our election stories, is so important because it has implications on our economy as well. You know, narratives matter. The narratives that we put out there for investors, for our public, they ultimately have impact on ordinary Africans and their day-to-day. So as storytellers, whether it's journalism, filmmaking, we want to really, the privilege to tell stories and have people listen. We want to steward that well, and we want to tell the stories as well as can be. So that's really the heart behind this toolkit that I'm about to present to you now. And the discussion, the panel discussion that we will have immediately after I'm done, is really to reinforce some of the findings and some of the discussions that we will find also in the toolkit, and to also give you guys as well. We'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a question and answer time to also give you guys, everyone who's in the room, a chance to also share their 2 cents, to join to the discussion, because this is a collaborative work and the learning never stops. So what I'm going to do now, just very quickly before I hand over for the panel discussion, I'm just quickly going to officially introduce you to the guide, and to say, if you check in the chat group just now, Lesero will share. Lesero will put the link to where you can download we'll put the link to where you can download the guide. And we encourage you to do so. Download it, share it with members of your newsrooms, share it with your colleagues in whatever aspect that you work in. What I'll do just now is I'll just briefly give us an overview of the guide so that you know what's inside and you know what to expect. So what you will be seeing on your screen just now is what the cover actually looks like. This is the beautiful cover of the handbook, of the guide. And the guide, it has 4 chapters or 4 sections, so to say. The introductory section just takes us through the journey we took to get to the guide, the why it matters. And I briefly explained why it matters, because the narratives about Africa create reality on the ground. Just this year alone, almost 20 countries, 20 African countries will have elections, and how these elections are viewed by the people locally and the people on international investors is very important. And I want to say, not that you should misunderstand us in any way, to say that we want to, start not telling the hard truth. In no way are we advocating that we should not tell the hard truth, but we are saying we should not be fixed on a single story. And there are many other stories on many nuances and many complexities that do not come through when we tell the story of elections in Africa that must start coming through. And I'll explain a little bit more just as I go through the guide. So the first section is just an introduction. And then the second section of the guide talks about, it gives practical. That's one of the things we love so much about this guide, is that it gives practical steps and practical things we can do and consider for our newsrooms and for our work. So practical things that we should stop doing, practical things we must start doing, and we'll have a little look at some of that right now. And then there's a chapter on recommendations, what we want to do moving forward. And then there's also the last one is just conclusions and ending remarks. And I'll go through some of this just very quickly. Not too much time for the discussion. I'll very briefly just go through what you can expect when we say what to start, what to stop. So, for example, the section on what to stop doing, it includes things like changing our newsroom culture. For example, I remember in the focus groups, it was the focus group that we had with foreign correspondents, and one of them said, when it's time for elections, it's almost like there's a written script that we repeat every single year without changing it. We know which people we need to talk to. We know which polls we need to look out for. We know which areas we need to go to. And it's set in stone almost. And we repeat this every year, which is why we find that election coverage is the same every year. So one of the things we encourage in the guide is that let's not do that. Let's not repeat the same practices that give us the same results all the time. And many of these journalists actually said, we are actually bored with our own coverage. And we know as storytellers that if my story bores me, it will most likely bore the audience. So we want to change the way we do things. I was a journalist for many years, and I covered a few elections. And not once do I remember my newsroom or the newsrooms I worked for, not once do I remember us having a debriefing to say, okay, what did we do? what do we want to change for the next elections, and kind of also going in the next election, going, okay, how are we making this better? So changing. So one of the things you find in the guide about what to stop is newsroom practices and so many other things. Then there's also a section about what we want to start doing. We want to start embracing alternative voices. There are some people whose voices either never come up or they're given so few spaces in in election coverage, and that's definitely something that we want to start giving alternative voices more of a platform during elections. One of the big things that came out, and we actually focus a lot on this in the guide, is the issue of amplifying voices of young people. There's this prevailing narrative that African youth is not interested in elections, and it's used as a blanket for all youth. But we know that's not true. We know that young people are increasingly getting involved in politics and actually making huge changes in the political landscape of their country, whether at a local level or at a national level. So we need to reinterrogate these things that we keep saying that hold us back from finding new stories. And the issue of young people is one of those things. And we have case studies in the guide where you can see, for example, there's a case study about Nigerian young people in the past election, where you can see how it's actually not true. As a blanket statement saying that young people are not interested in politics, it's just simply not true. And if that's not true, how do we begin to amplify the voices of the young people who are making a change and doing amazing things? And then there's also just checking yourself and checking. There's a section where we speak about these things we can do as a collective, but there's also a section where we need to speak about how you need to check yourself as a storyteller, because often what we produce is filtered through our own bias. Just one quick example. One of the journalists we spoke to in the focus group said, my perspective changed so much after after I covered the US election in 2016. Because then I used to think, oh, Africans and democracy, they don't know what they're doing, everything goes wrong. But once she went to cover the American election, and she saw firsthand how those elections are also very messy, and how democracy in its nature is a messy beast. It changed her narrative, and it made her see that actually some of the things that we amplify and we see as, oh, doom and gloom, we only do so because it's Africa and because of the beliefs and the stereotypes we have towards Africans. So there's a section where you can actually also check your own biases, and think about the environment around you and how that's impacting your stories. So I'm just quickly going to wrap up here. And I mean, Lisara would have put in the chat a link to the guide where you can download the guide and share the guide and go through the guide and see how you can incorporate it into your work. But I think just in just concluding this session, so I don't take up too much time, I think the main thing to remember is that as storytellers, we are very powerful, and we are in a very privileged position to create reality, because narratives become reality. There are some people who believe something only because they've seen it in the media. And people with that much power really need to be really need to steward that power well, and we really need to think about how we are serving our communities, how we are serving our country through the how we tell the story of the African election. And this is something that's going to come out also in the panel discussion that's about to start now, interrogating the impact of what we do, because once we understand that, we will really consider a lot more how we tell the stories and what stories that we tell. And I want to emphasize again, we are not saying that we want to whitewash what's happening in our communities, but we are saying there's a lot more what's been told already. And with that, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over back to Ndombi to introduce our moderator for the panelists, and we will get started with the panel discussion.
Thank you, Mama Ponya. Indeed, as storytellers, we all need to check ourselves and interrogate our biases and our thought processes on election reporting. And our next panel discussion really is about that. It's called Rethinking Election Reporting. It's going to be for about 45 minutes, and it's an opportunity to discuss how we need to improve our election coverage by providing guidelines to avoid these stereotypes and biases that we often find ourselves in when we report. We're fortunate to have Quinta Mbori. She is the Executive Director of the Association of Media Women in Kenya, who will be moderating this panel. Quinta is also an award-winning journalist with over 12 years experience. She's passionate about advocating for marginalized voices. So thank you so much, Quinta. Over to you to lead us into this panel discussion.
Hey, thank you, Ndombi. Thank you, Mama Fonya, and indeed, thank you everyone for joining this discussion. I'm joining you live from Nairobi, Kenya, that country in East Africa where our youth have been in the news for protesting against poor governance in the country. And probably that is the reason why I was given this opportunity to moderate. But that's on a light note. So I would want to just get right into it and just do a brief introduction about the discussion for the day before I can introduce to you our panelists. And indeed, before I even get to that, I just want to thank each and every one of you for joining in from whichever part of the world. Thank you so much for actively participating in this discussion. So this webinar is actually sponsored. How to Write About African Elections is proudly sponsored by Africa No Filter in collaboration with Free College of Communications. ANF, as it is popularly known, is a non-profit organization that works to challenge and change harmful narratives about Africa by amplifying authentic and diverse stories from the continent. As you may be aware, Free College of Communications provides short courses and qualifications in journalism and communication across the African continent and beyond. And today we are joined by a powerful panel. I'm very excited to introduce them. Before I introduce them, let me just send a shout out to the journalists and media professionals who have joined, especially the ones who have already covered elections in Africa and the ones who are yet to cover the upcoming elections. Also, I would like to recognize editors and newsroom leaders from African countries, especially the ones that will have elections from 2024-2026. I know we have media trainers and journalism educators in the room. Thank you so much and welcome. We also have civil society organizations focused on media and democracy. Thank you for joining. We have students of journalism and communication, and then we also have African electoral commissions. Thank you so much for joining. As Ntombi had introduced me, I'm the executive director at the Association of Media Women in Kenya, and my name is Quinta Mbori. AMWIC, as it is popularly known, is the National Membership Association in Kenya for all women in media communications, PR, academia, and we've been existent for around 42 years. So I would like to go straight to the panelists, and if you allow me, I'll just read their profiles, and then we will get to hear their voices as we talk about the topic of the day. So today we are joined by one, Zoe Titus. Let me send apologies in advance in case I massacre your names and I do not pronounce them correctly. But I hope I'll be able to learn how to pronounce them as the conversation progresses. So Zoe Titus is the director of the Namibia Media Trust, where she manages initiatives in media innovation, digital transformation, and media literacy. She's deeply committed to media development, freedom of expression, and access to information, dedicating her career to these causes. Titus also advises various regional and international projects, including ARISA, and she co-founded a major online platform for media policy education in Africa. She's the former regional director of the Media Institute of Southern Africa, where she led efforts to support journalists in danger and advance media policies. Maybe Zoe, you can just turn on your camera and send us a wave emoji. We'll still get back to you as we get into the discussion. And yes, thank you, Zoe. And we can also respond back by just sending clap emojis. Let's make Zoe feel at home and feel welcome. And we have another panelist, Utsa Mokone. Utsa is the editor and publisher of the Sunday Standard in Botswana. And we'll be discussing issues around, media sustainability, journalism, and how that impacts the overall coverage of elections in Africa. I'm very excited. He has over 30 years of experience as an editor and journalist for some of Botswana's most prolific publications. And he's also known for bold stories that speak to power and challenge the status quo. So Utsa, please just turn on your video and wave to us so that we can know that you're in the room. Thank you very much. And then we have Azimfweleli Langalanga. I hope I've got that correctly. He's the Executive Director of African Geopolitics and Geoeconomics Advisors, an organization that provides geopolitical advice to companies that want to invest in African countries. And his background is in diplomacy, trade, negotiations, and international political economy. Welcome, Langalanga, Mr. Langalanga. And finally, we have Festus Owete. Festus is general editor of Premium Times, which is Nigeria's foremost online newspaper. He also heads the newspaper's national desk, which has bits on the presidency, and that's the State House, the National Assembly, all political parties, and security. As the head desk, Mr. Owete edits all stories filed by the reporters covering these beats, and the position he holds as general editor is purely administrative. Before joining Premium Times, that's about 11 years ago, Mr. Owete had reported for some of Nigeria's major newspapers, including Punch, Daily Independent, Next. I think right now we don't have Next, and then we have the News magazine. He also reported on some of the beats listed above while working for these organizations. Mr. Owete has also covered major elections, and that is national and subnational in Nigeria, since the restoration of democracy in the country in 1999. In 2017, he was one of the 8 Africans selected by the German government to cover the country's general election. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is our panel, and we want to discuss how to write about African elections. With over 17 elections anticipated in Africa in 2024, Africa's election calendar is overbooked. And some people have called 2024 a super elections year. And maybe this makes sense as to why fraycollege as well as African Filter decided to come up with this survey. It is quite timely. So countries like Comoros, they had the elections in January, Senegal, March, Chad, South Africa. Many more presidential elections will happen in Africa between now and December this year. We're talking about countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau. So we are quite busy in terms of elections in Africa. So this webinar seeks to interrogate the narrative around African electoral processes and the role of media in setting and building an electoral agenda that ultimately reflects the diverse and dynamic realities on the ground. What is the current state of election reporting in Africa, and what can be done to change the status quo? I don't know whether we are happy with how we are reporting elections, but that is the essence of this discussion. This webinar brings together leading voices in journalism, media training, and election coverage to share best practices and also to explore innovative approaches to election reporting. Just as has been done in the first part, this webinar seeks to launch the African No Filter Handbook on Reporting Elections, which Mama Ponya has done, which is a comprehensive guide aimed at equipping journalists and storytellers with the tools and perspectives needed to cover elections more ethically and comprehensively. John, you can use this guide as a reference tool to improve your reporting skills, develop new story angles, as well as ensure that coverage is fair, balanced, and impactful. So we want to broadly look at how we can overcome stereotypes in election coverage. We'd also want to look at how to understand and contextualize political landscapes, as well as to highlight positive narratives and democratic engagement in our lovely continent. So without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would want you to help me in having this discussion on the online platform. And to everyone who has joined in, I have one question for you before we can finally hear from the panelists. And the question you're asking you today is, what comes to mind when you think about elections in Africa? You can share your thoughts on the chat. You can also share your thoughts on the social media platforms. What comes to mind when you think about elections in Africa? We'll put that in the parking lot. We'll come back to review your feedback. You can also include your country of origin. What comes to mind when you think about elections, say in Zambia, elections in South Africa, elections in Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia? What comes to mind? We would like to hear from you. Put your input, your feedback on the chat, but you can also go to the socials on X, on Facebook, on TikTok. Remember, you can tag our sponsors for the day, and the hashtags is Shifting Narratives, African Election Narratives. You can tag fraycollege as well as Africa No Filter. What comes to mind when you think about elections in Africa? We would like to hear from you. Okay, so I'm going to, I want us now to hear the voices of our panelists, and we'll have 2 rounds of questioning. And then once we are done with that, we'll get back to you to hear your reactions, your comments, and then we can just wind up. So Zoe is the director of Namibia Media Trust, and we just have one question for you, Zoe. When you talk about elections in Africa, do we have elections or selections in Africa? I encountered that discussion online, and the argument was that more often than not, the election results are always predetermined in Africa, with the incumbent often wanting to stick to power. So do we have selections or do we have elections in Africa? Yes, Zoe. You're muted, Zoe. We can't hear you. Please unmute.
Apologies. Thank you for that question. And just to let everyone know, Namibia will be going to the polls on the 27th of November. To answer your question, I think it's never an either or. The debate around whether African elections represent true democratic practices or are merely a selection is an oversimplification of the really diverse political landscapes across the continent. And that distinction between elections and selections, for example, often hinges on perceptions shaped by the prevalence, I think, of misinformation and disinformation. There are indeed, without a doubt, instances where electoral processes are manipulated, or one, as you indicated earlier, predetermined, but it is crucial to recognize the efforts in many countries, I think, that genuinely engage their citizens. For example, in certain instances, there is really sincere and committed efforts to democratic principles where with increasing voter turnout and civic participation. As an example, it even took me by surprise that in Namibia, 91% of eligible voters, 91% of eligible voters have registered for the upcoming elections. I think that is really exciting. Again, the flip side of that story is, will they actually turn up on the day? We have seen in certain instances grassroots movements in certain countries where their perceptions are noted in the media, where they are actively advocating for transparency and accountability, which is crucial to this process. In Namibia, we are investing a lot, and I know elsewhere it's the same. We are investing a lot in focusing on voter-centered election reporting. And I think I have seen the change. So we can't just purely speak about elections or selection. It's a little more complex than that. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Zoe, and we wish you all the best in the upcoming elections. I'm just going through the charts before I introduce our next panelist so we can hear their voice, and that's Utsa Mokone. Please be on standby. I would like to just read a few feedback from the audience, and yes, I can see the question we asked was, what comes to mind when you think about elections from whichever part of the continent you come from? And I see Karen Duplays. Sincere apologies again if I don't pronounce your names correctly. I see Karen says colorful and noisy election campaigns come to mind, and that is from South Africa. I see Jacqueline Muchazureka from Zimbabwe say, I think about challenges faced by women in accessing campaign financing. And these are issues that we are actually going to talk about when it comes to representation of different constituencies during the election process in Africa. Lillian from Tanzania says, for me, it feels like a season where corruption takes center stage. Well, those are very honest comments coming from, everyone. And I cannot wait for us to just think about how we can turn these narratives around and how we can rewrite, the African elections, beyond the rigging, beyond the corruption, beyond all these negative stereotypes that, have been perpetuated. Is there a possibility of just rewriting these narratives? So allow me to just jump back to my panelists, and I want us to hear the voice of Utsa Mukone, who is the editor and publisher of the Sunday Standard in Botswana. Utsa, the media has always been on the spot because they say that the media shapes perception, the media shapes narrative, we set agenda, and we play a critical role in disseminating information to the electorate, because ultimately that's the information that they rely on to make decision at the ballot at the ballot box during elections. So do we say that in Africa, or just based from where you come from your context, is it true, has the media been playing that, has the media been critical in terms of just being the strength, the face, the pulse of what is happening in society? Or has the media been a weakness? Has the media been a critical strength or a weakness to the electoral process? So the floor is yours. Do we have Utsa? Okay, I'll quickly jump. I'll probably come back to Utsa when we're able to get hold of him. I'll move on to the next panelist, and that's Azimfeleli Langalanga. And he's African geopolitics. He works for African geopolitics and geoeconomics advisors. Langalanga, your question is around, the essence of elections in Africa, and more often than not, they are framed around political parties and candidates, or the electoral governing bodies. They are rarely about, the people or the needs of the people. In terms of when you talk about access to information, how come we are not able to relay the actual stories or the actual needs of the people? And how can the media prioritize the real issues that affect citizens? Langalanga, if you're on, please respond to that question as we get to hear you.
And thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity. Thanks. So that is a complex question. In that, in my own field of study and work, we normally say, as a political economy questions, which says to whose interest. So we do look at the media as an agenda, playing an agenda setting role in society, but also we ask ourselves, it does that on whose interest? And your question talks to the fact that in many instances, elections in Africa, they have a history of serving elite interests. These are the interests of the domestic elites, and also, but maybe in the main global elites. And this is a historical role, there is a historical context to it, whereby we find Africa as a colonized continent fighting liberation struggles, that then after that there was a Cold War, where then Africa became a contested terrain between the East and the West. And with the evolution of the post-colonial state was such that it was framed between East and West, and elections were also impacted by this dichotomy between the East and West, with a lot of coups, a lot of one-party states, and maybe in the last 20 years, we started to see some semblance of democratization. But running as an undercurrent in all these issues was the contestation that was there between the United States and Russia during the Cold War. But when the Cold War ended, there was then the United States became the dominant power as the leader of the international economic order. This then meant that the US had a much more bigger role to play, which is why the elections then started to talk to a lot of issues around democratization and values that talk to democracy, human rights, and all that. But in the main, these issues still, because the democratization was at that level still really an elite thing. So there was not much of talk about issues from the ground, because democracy was coming from as a top-down approach. And lately we have seen the China becoming more powerful and having a big role to play in the continent. And also China's engagement with the continent is at an elite level, even though it doesn't come with the democratization aspirations. And we've also seen Russia also coming into the continent. And so these issues, the continent is a contested terrain, and those links being done at an elite level have inadvertently made the media focus also on issues of elections from an elite level, with the people on the ground being left out. So we normally also look at the media as a space of diplomatic contestation. And the media itself has also found itself sometimes inadvertently pushing an elite narrative that talks to these issues that I've reflected on. So if one was to sit now and imagine the elections in Namibia, the elections that are coming in Ethiopia and all these other areas. I could, without engaging on any media article or news article, have an idea of what the election in Ethiopia, for instance, what will be told are the issues there. Will be told a lot about the Abiy coming into power. He was given a Nobel Prize, and there were issues with the Tigrayan war. And there is a narrative also that says there's a lot of infrastructure development going on in Ethiopia that is funded by the Chinese. There will be also issues about the human rights violations that happened in Tigray. But once you really look at these narratives, you realize that they actually serve elite interests. Not much will be talked about the farmers in the south of Ethiopia and things like that, and what their aspirations are for their elections. If you go to Botswana, you'll be told a lot about how Masisi has become too close to China, that the former president Khama was much more democratic. But what we're not told is what the Botswana people themselves are saying about, let's say, the indigenous people who are in the game reserve, whose rights have been violated and they've been displaced. Botswana's practice of the death penalty and how maybe the people are feeling on the ground, the issues of the people in rural Botswana, the farmers, and how they are being affected by climate change and things like that. But it's because the African continent itself has been captured by elite interests, but global elite interests, and the media is part of, in the main, really part of those contestations. And maybe what should then be done is to ensure that the media itself starts to play a role of, or to reflect the agency with an A of the African people themselves. And this can be much more easier now with the digital transformation of the media. Maybe just to conclude, there is a discussion now in elections around disinformation, and that discussion itself has not been spared of this elite contestation. Sometimes what is deemed to be disinformation is a narrative that maybe gives an alternative view of developments in Africa. So if you were to kind of talk a lot about infrastructure projects that the Chinese are doing in Africa, if you do that too much, that can be said to be disinformation. But if you talk about how AGOA is changing lives in Benin or wherever, that will not be looked as disinformation. So it's much more complex than it looks, and the media unfortunately is caught up in this also. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Langalanga. That was a really elaborate response, and I want our next speaker to respond. Festus, before I bring you on board, I just want to go through some more feedback from the comment section. We asked, when it comes to reporting on elections in Africa, what comes to mind, what issues are raised from wherever you are, from your context. I can see Winnie says from winner take all approach in some context. Dr. PP says, I see irregularities, especially in Cameroon. Kyoko says more years of suffering, especially if a certain party is going for election. That Kyoko must be from Kenya. When you talk about elections in Congo, corruption on the winning party. Then we have Deborah Mutoi says, talking about Zambian politics, the last ones being held close to 2-3 years ago, we had the youth stand up in numbers to vote for their best candidate. And now with the current situation, it's hard to tell who is likely to turn up to vote because most of their dreams got shattered once the president was elected. Prior to elections, we have these promises that were made of things going to be better. It's hard to tell the future of Zambian elections. And I'm going to take the last comment before I come down to Festus. When it comes to how to write about African elections, should journalists or storytellers focus on only political parties, or they must also focus on the electoral management body that will conduct elections? We'll put that question in the parking lot. We'll get back to it. So I just want to invite our next speaker, and that's Festus Oweke. Festus, I would like you to respond to Mr. Langalanga's comment about the media pushing the elitist narrative, where there's so much focus on what's happening at the top, as opposed to what happens to the people, So what do you think the media can do to turn this around? How can we sort of like strike a balance between pushing the elitist narrative as well as, making sure that we are able to voice the needs of the people who elect these leaders into office? And the second part of that question, Festus, is that do media organizations, in your opinion, do they have the capacity to do this based on what we have seen happening in the media landscape? Do they have the capacity? Do they have the resources? Do they have the goodwill? Do they have the know-how to push a balanced agenda so that we're able to cater for both sides without really overlooking the other? Festus, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Good day, everyone. Can you hear me? Good day, everyone.
I can hear you.
All right, great. Yeah. So thank you very much. Yeah. From what Mr. Lagalaga has explained, my take is that we, as a media organization, we are trying to push the voice of the people out there, so that the interest of the elite alone will not be taken care of. And so I'm going to talk about what we do here. In the last few elections, we tried to push the voices of the people, especially the marginalized group. When I talk about the marginalized, I'm talking about the youth, probably women, the people with disabilities, so that their interests can also be taken care of. Yeah. Now, I am in charge of deployment in my organization anytime we are holding elections, whether it is national elections or sub-national elections. So we brief them, we brief our reporters when they're going to the field, and we tell them clearly, yes, you report the elite, you report the gladiators, the candidates, but the voice of the people must be heard. So what we ask them to do that, okay, if you are on the ground, you are attending a rally, you are attending a campaign rally, yes, you must listen to the candidate who is running for the election, but you must also speak to the people. Now, we ask them to speak to interview the people, ask them if the person running for that office probably is seeking a fresh mandate, or is even been a fresh candidate. Now, if the person is seeking a fresh mandate, ask the people what the person has done in the previous position he is occupying, or he currently occupies. What he has done, has he been able to deliver on his promises? So those are the things we are trying to do here. So, but again, what we again do is that because we want to push out issues, not really personalities. So what we do, like we did in the 2023 election, where we have 3 strong candidates, or about, let's say 4 strong candidates. Then we have some few minor candidates. Let me put it that way. Now, what we did was to put the manifestos together. Bring these manifestos, pick out the salient issues of economy, issues of security, issues of anti-corruption, and all of that. We then analyze these things, then push it out there and say, look at what this candidate is going to do. Look at this, what this candidate B is going to do. Look at what the candidate C is going to do. Now, we now put these things together and push it out there to allow people read. To allow people read and get, to get to know who they want to vote for. So, but in doing all of this, I talked about marginalization group earlier. In doing all of this, we try to reach out to the youth. The youth, that is the young people, they form the bulk of our population in Nigeria. Yeah, over 60%. And so, and in fact, in the 2023 election, they really defined the election. They defined the election because they came out en masse to vote for their candidates. So we target the youth, and the way we target these youth is by using the social media platforms, and particularly Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We use some of these social media platforms to use it because we know the form. And like we say in Nigeria, I don't know what is said elsewhere, that the future belongs to the youth, that they are future leaders. Yeah. So we try to reach out to them so that they will also give us feedback on what they feel about governance in the country. So we use this platform to push these things out. The older people are not, or the older generation are not too used to these platforms. So these platforms are just for the youth. And so these youths, they give us feedback, what they feel. And and we're making progress in this regard. In the last election, in the 2023 election, out of the 9.4 million voters that registered, I think over 80% of them, I think 7 point something million, were the young ones. Yes, they were the young ones. And so they really play a major role in that election. And so we are trying to take put the interests of the marginalized group, in place so that they can also be part of the electoral process. So this is, I don't know if I'll be able to, to respond adequately or appropriately to your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Festus. Yeah, maybe just a follow-up question would be, do you think the media has capacity to transform, all these activities that are happening on the socials, all activities that are happening, in terms of how you are able to involve the youth and the marginalized? Do these narratives, do they make it to the news? Do they make it to platforms that they can be used for, policy making, for decision making, for, to transform what we are used to? I don't know. Do you think the media has the capacity to handle the workload or the expectations that society has on them?
I don't think so. Because even at previous times, we still struggle to get the resources to do our work. We still struggle. And that is why sometimes we look for grants, sometimes we we do membership. And then we go out there asking people who can support our work, to support. So we have the capacity to do that, but the resources we don't have. And that is basically the truth, because I'm talking from experience here. I've been here for over 10 years, and then we try to and advert, we really don't have adverts to generate resources. So that I don't think we have up to 2% of our funding from up to 2% of funding from adverts. So we have to rely on other areas, to get the resources to do the work. But talking about capacity, I think we have the capacity. African media has a capacity. African media organizations have the capacity. It's just that we don't have the resources, to push through what we really want to do. Yeah. And I also think that the powers that be, those in government, the government functionaries, I think they are also listening to the youth, because sometimes you see them adjusting their programs and their policies because they want to bring in the youth, accommodate the youth in all of these, because if you play with the youth from experience. Now, if you look at the role they played in the 2023 general election, you know that the youth are out, and they are ready to pick whoever they want. You talk about the protests. The protests are held in the last 4 years. We had the NSAS protest in 2020. Then we also had one just I would say 2 months ago. That was in August. And bad governance. And they speak. I mean, they spoke about what they want in the country. And I want to believe that when our president was making a National Day broadcast just 2 days ago, he said he was going to convene a national youth conference. So that indicates that the government is listening to the youth and maybe other marginalized group. But I think that in the electoral process, the women are still marginalized. The PW people living with disabilities are still marginalized. So okay, I think I should just stop here for now.
So in other fronts, they say the youth are the leaders of today, not tomorrow. So that's of course debatable.
Oh, that is quite
The youth are the
debatable.
leaders of today.
Yes.
Yes, it's
I
debatable.
was listening to a woman just the other day, and she was saying one of the lies that is being told in the country is that the youth are the leaders of today and tomorrow, that the youth have no play. But that's, I don't think that is right anyway. Well, because I think that someday, if we keep on with this agitation, someday the youth will be there.
Exactly. Yeah, we've started seeing the revolution in some of the African countries, and we hope that in a few years to come, we'll be able to debunk the myth that we can only have presidents who are, who are old and they are not men. So I'm going to just go through some of the reactions. Again, the question you're asking is what comes to mind when you talk about elections in Africa? I can authoritatively report that up to this moment, we do not have any good news in the comment section. It's all hue and cry, and Leocadia says no elections in Cameroon. Elections are just drama. System in place for one person, Paul Biya, over 90 years and 40 years in power, ready to stand and win again. Well, yeah, that's Leocadia's opinion. We must reassess the Western liberal democracy and its application to Africa. Even in the West, it is facing challenges. In Kenya, we've been having some discussions about negotiated democracy, where we infuse the less antagonistic Western type of democracy of winner take all and get communities to negotiate to allow for inclusion and representation of difficult communities, including the marginalized. I want to get back to my panelists. Just hold your thoughts. I will try as much as possible to read all your comments and give them visibility. Talk about Western influence. I want to come back to Utsa. Utsa is the editor and publisher of the Sunday Standard Botswana. Utsa, maybe you can just indicate to me that you are now available and you can talk before I can raise my question. Utsa, are you in the building? Okay, Utsa. So in the absence of Utsa, I'll go back to Zoe. And Zoe, I'll talk about the standards that have been set, for African elections. We've been benchmarking a lot. There has been talk that Africa benchmarks a lot in terms of media coverage based on what international media is doing. And their coverage, more often than not, is limited to the negative aspects of election processes in Africa. Here we are talking about corruption, violence, weak governance, poor economies. So the question I'm asking you, Zoe, is this the actual picture? Based on the comments that we have seen from our listeners and the participants, do you think that the standards that have been set by international media in terms of covering electoral processes, is that the actual picture on the ground, or is there more to election coverage and processes in Africa? Here we are talking about, Africa being referred to as the dark continent, and we are associated with everything else apart from good news, chaos, and the development, a lot more about what is not happening in Africa. So Zoe, do you think this is the actual picture? Or are we, does the media portray negatively African election processes intentionally?
There's so much to say about this topic, and it's so complex. Let's first agree that journalists are guided by their national codes of conduct and ethics. And these codes also speak to coverage of elections. So that would normally guide them. But coverage of elections require a very particular set of skills. So let us first not make the assumption that every journalist in a newsroom is going to be able to report on the elections. And in most instances, the editorial team would come together and allocate specific themes and beats to their journalists. But that said, let us also make the distinction between how African journalists are covering elections and how Western media is covering African elections. There is a very clear distinction. And in every instance, the way elections is covered is fueled by interest, whomever's interest that is. I think that more and more in our part of the world, we are trying to put the voter at the center of this process. So yes, I did initially say that, this is a more complex issue. We can't just talk, when you asked me this question about election and selection, and yes, people were speaking about a preoccupation with issues of violence and corruption. But, for example, if you were to look as a reference point to the Afrobarometer reports, in Namibia, the last one was done quite recently, I think in South Africa. The last one was done in 2021, 2022. It gives us some insight into where our citizens are in terms of their perceptions of their governments, their perceptions of democracy. It gives us insight into what the young people feel about democracy and elections very clearly. And even if the media does not respond to the ambitions and needs and desires of young people are going to find out that information, and they are operating in their own spaces. Yes, it is a lot more complex. We also have to appreciate the news production process. And these are all different elements, but what is increasingly important, as I said, and I do see efforts being made to put the voter at the center of reporting. And to go back to a question you asked earlier, where you asked about the issue of capacity. Africa No Filter fraycollege is developing this toolkit. And that is probably as a result of an observation or an expressed need for responding to a particular gap in the quality of reporting. So again, that immediately speaks to the issue of capacity. So, and the other thing is, I am a huge supporter, proponent of public interest journalism. And public interest journalism and the concept of elections are inextricably tied. Elections determine to a great extent how we are responding to our economy, how we are living our daily lives, the kinds of taxes we pay, etc. I lost my train of thought there for a second, but I hope that I answered your question. I just wanted to point out when we speak about capacity as well, that we must acknowledge the fact that we are experiencing, the media in itself is experiencing probably its biggest challenge currently in terms of its own sustainability, where we are dealing with shrinking newsrooms, and those shrinking newsrooms where there is an increasingly juniorization of the newsrooms. Journalists and media houses are now facing this challenge of reporting on elections, reporting on it in a way that responds to the needs of their viewers, listeners, readers. So yeah, that must also be taken into consideration.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. I'll quickly review some more comments before we can open it up to everyone to probably just have their thoughts shared. It will be very brief, about 10 minutes, and then we can take it back to the panelists to give their final remarks. Thinking around, solutions. How do we transform the status quo? How do we rewrite the African narratives in terms of election reporting? And how do we ensure that we as journalists, as media practitioners, as researchers, as civil society organization, how can we leverage on the resources that we have to ensure that we give balanced, fair coverage and truthful coverage of Africa's elections? So I see Abdi Omar from Somali says independent media is lacking, particularly when it comes to fair and impartial reporting during elections. Many journalists do not have the necessary skills to cover elections effectively, which limits the quality of depth reporting on candidates running for high offices. This gap in coverage prevents the public from accessing the critical information they need to make informed choices. We would love to hear your thoughts. Oh yeah, that's from Free College. We have Martha Tukahiro says, in the work that I'm currently doing, we are now working with media to start building positive and alternative narratives around elections way before elections are held, thus looking the entire electoral cycle before, during, and after elections. We see this important in building peace and social cohesion and broadly rewriting a different narrative about elections in Uganda. Kudos, that's a good job from Martha. I think we need to explore opportunities for collaboration as media practitioners in all our facets of praxis to push more aggressive and decolonized narratives about Africa elections. Beyond this, how do we navigate resource mobilization for some of this collaborative work? That's a question for you, our sponsors, Free College and African Unfiltered. Most media houses are owned by these same politicians, so they use the media to advance their cause in order to remain in power forever. That is the case in Ghana. Azure says, I agree, but what do we expect if the concept of democracy was forced down the throat of Africa? I think the comments are coming in fast and aggressive, furiously. There are myriad of tricks used in African elections. I wonder what exactly is the role of monitoring observers and the security officers. Journalists still depend on politicians to cover elections. During elections, the politicians are paid hell of money in the sense of pension. Most of them spend the money to corrupt the voters. If you want to write an effective story about African elections, the time to empower the journalist, not only with trainings, but also with transport and financial support. It's still the conversation around sustainability and resources and capacity. So I'm going to open it up. Maybe I'll hand it back to Mama Ponya for some quick reactions on the comments that have so far been shared. If you have any question to a specific panelist, you can also state as much, and then we come back to wind up because I see time is not on our side. So Mama Ponya, back to you to just help coordinate the comments and the reactions.
Thanks, Quinta. I think because there's quite a few comments, we wouldn't be able to keep up. What we can do, Quinta, is that I think maybe you can just do one more round with the panelists, and then in terms of having the people engage, we can spend last 10 minutes or so we can ask people to raise their hands, and maybe we can pick 1, 2, or 3 people who can open their mics and just share. instead of going through the comments, because there's quite a lot there.
Yeah. Thanks, Mama Ponya, for that direction. So I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Langalanga. The youth issue has really come up in this discussion in terms of their potential, in terms of the youth revolution, participation, and the role of young people in election reforms, as well as, just widening the democratic spaces in different countries in Africa. We've seen a lot of youth uprising and digital activism happening across the continent. How well do you think we can tap into this resource to ensure that we use it for the overall good of advancing positive election reporting in Africa? Mr. Langalanga, as also you give your final thoughts, because I know you might not be able to, you might not get the chance to speak after this. Langalanga.
Excellent, Pinta. Yeah, I mean, the majority of the African population is young people. And I think with the penetration of digital media and also access to internet, the young people have managed to kind of free themselves of the dichotomies that I referred to earlier. So they are able to, in real time, contribute to ideas and to the discussions on how they feel like their communities should be run. So I think the media, what the media could do to enhance that voice is to engage more with the youth and use what they get from the youth as a way of framing their own stories and then linking them up with the major or the general approach. The other thing that I think is important to do is the media can also play an educative role. If you go to most of these countries, there are national development plans, there is industrial policy plans, and other plans that are sought to advance economic development, which is, I think, is the main deliverable that politicians could do in their societies. So I think there is a need to play an educative role to the communities, to hold politicians to account. Like during election time, what can be done is to go to communities and see what has been promised before and what is being delivered at the moment and what has not been delivered. So I think in the main, it's important to play that educative role and also to enhance the voices of the youth, but also because the youth, I think they play more a role in the digital space. So it's also important to find ways of countering like disinformation and fake news that might also be used to kind of either mute or push for more extremist views in that space. Thanks a lot.
Langalanga, and your final thoughts? Do you have any final thoughts before I release you? Okay, so I'm going to go to Festus, and your question is actually come from the chat. The issue of media ownership. Dr. PP says, may we equally understand that we have both private and public media. In most cases, it's a private media that most often push to balance and ensure that the voice of the people are heard. Most public media engage in advocacy for ruling party. The state itself is a perpetrator of shrinking civic space. So, Mr. Festus, how do we navigate the issue around media ownership and electoral independence?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me use the case of Nigeria as an example. Yeah, virtually all the state government. We have 36 state government and federal capital administration, and all of these have their own media organizations, and of course, naturally, they will do everything to support their government. There's their payers. the national government also have, the federal government also has its own media organization. So, but we have many private organizations in Nigeria, private media organizations in Nigeria. One of them is Premium Times, which I work for. And so because we are not on the payroll of the government, so we are independent, and so we can report anything we see. During the elections, we can report anything. But government organization cannot afford to do that, because if they do that, they may not even get their pay at the end of the month. In fact, that is even a simpler matter. Sometimes they get sacked, because of maybe because they reported negative issues of the government. And so it's a difficult one, but I don't know how we can balance this. It's a difficult one because when you talk about resources, government has the resources to promote their media, the media organizations. But we, like I said earlier, the private organizations were still struggling. And one thing we try not to do is to compromise, despite the fact that we are also looking for resources, to do our work. We refuse to compromise. And everybody in Nigeria knows that whatever you see on our platform is the truth, because we know you cannot bend us, and so, but I don't know how we can do it, but the way around it, if we have to be independent in whatever we report, especially election issues, I think is to look for resources outside the government. Looking for private people who can also invest in such organizations. I think this is the way to go. But I don't know if this can be the major solution. But I think this is, to me, I think this is what we can do. I don't think I have more to add.
Thank you, Festus. Food for thought. Maybe we need to put that somewhere. We can have follow-up discussion with the Free College as well as African Unfiltered and other organizations that are represented in this conversation. Finally, I will get to Zoe, and the question is around representation. One, Jacqueline Mwichazoreka said in Zimbabwe, when she thinks about elections, she's reminded about women, struggling to access campaign financing. And of course, there are many other issues around representation in elections in Africa. We have the marginalized, the youth, people with disability. How do we leverage on the media to present their case, to build around the issues that affect them, to uplift them, and also work on issues of representation? How do we ensure that we are able to build up their capacity so that they are able to actively participate in the electoral process and have the same translated into the media space? Zoe, let's try and talk about representation of marginalized groups in Africa.
Okay.
As we wind up again.
Please, I'm trying to wrap up all my thoughts in this final opportunity that you're going to give me. So let me start with a recurring issue that's come up, and that is the youth. We speak about the youth bulge and the youth dividend, because that comes with great opportunities and great challenges for us. But I think that it's important that we not look at the youth as an homogeneous grouping. The youth in itself is diverse. And I think that is potentially a challenge for the media, to understand the issues of the youth. And then, I would then appeal to the youth as well to be clear about their agenda, because I'm in terms of the reporting and following discussions, it is not clear to me what the youth actually want. I recently did a kind of social media study on youth and social justice. And what I found, at least in Namibia, that the overriding issue that the youth discuss on social media is the issue of corruption. So if the media then reports on corruption as it relates to the youth, is that pushing a particular narrative? I think we have to have a lot more nuanced discussions about these things. The media must find itself and present itself as being relevant to its audiences first and foremost. And then when it comes to the issue of independence, for example, and I just wanted to touch on that very briefly, my expectation in terms of independence is that first, the bastion of independence during an electoral process should be your electoral commission, which is the most important institution in that particular, electoral cycle. And in the absence of that, it complicates the role that the media is going to play, the role that political parties will play. And then all these things are very context specific. So let me speak about the Namibian context, where there are questions about the independence of the Electoral Commission. I personally have questions about the capacity of opposition political parties. In many instances, and I've followed elections in other countries, the opposition parties do not have well-articulated communication strategies. How then would you expect the media to engage with that and to tell a particular story? Yes, without a doubt, women are underrepresented in the political spectrum. In the political ecosystem, in the information ecosystem, in the broader human rights ecosystem, women in politics are underrepresented. And the media, to a great extent, unfortunately, and I must acknowledge this, the media in this instance is a perpetrator of a lot of violence, and I will use inverted commas, violences against women, because they are, in many instances, media is not reporting on the position of this female woman political leader, but is more concerned about her wardrobe or what she looks like and how she comes across on a video, as opposed to the real issues that she is dealing with. And the issues that she is bringing to the electorate, and political finance also. And I wonder what the concern is around political financing. Is there because there is a lack of confidence in women being able to hold political leadership, to be accountable and transparent once they attain a certain position in political leadership? If you look, for example, at I think Genderling still does the barometer on political leadership or parliamentary representation of women, and from what I've read in recent years, there is an equalizing effect, but again, that must be considered in a much more nuanced effect. In Namibia, another example, we have what you call the zebra system. So when at the end of the day, you will have general parity in terms of male-female representation in parliament. But we also have to come back and question the quality of that representation. There are so many issues that come to mind, and then this becomes a challenge for the media, because the media must translate that for the general populace. The media has an incredibly important role to play, and all that I can ask for is that the media steps it up and make the elections a really relevant and poignant event, not event. We will not talk about elections as events, but a process for citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for the challenge. Media need to step up. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Mama Ponya to coordinate a few rounds of reactions. Then we can.
Thank you so much, Quinta, and thank you for moderating that discussion. And absolutely, you're right, Zoe. And one of the main findings in the guide and through our discussion is this thing of looking at elections as this event that comes every 5 years. But if you're going to tell the election story well, you really need to look at it as a process that goes from one election to the next election. I know that we've actually run out of time. And I mean, and thank you, Quinta, that as you were going through the discussion, you were also taking people's comments and questions, because in respecting people's time, I do want to just close up now. I know we had said that we would give time for Q&A, but I feel like we don't want to take up too much because we know that it's a busy work day. Especially for journalists, it's almost the weekend, so we don't want to take up too much of your time. So I do want to just go ahead and close, and I'll start in closing. I'll start by saying this guide, I think it's part of answering. It's a small part of answering also the challenge that Zoe had, because if the media can work effectively, then some of these challenges we can be able to meet head on. And I think in closing and about this guide and the discussions that we just had, I want to remind us that on the African continent, the media is on its knees, literally. Media organizations are on their knees, they're closing down. Journalists are not getting paid because financially we are not doing well. It's crisis, it's at a crisis level. And in there's many discussions that are happening around how we save our media, how we save journalism on the African continent. And one of the main things that keeps coming up is the role of the media and our communities understanding the role of the media as the fourth estate, as support for journalism not being an option. And that can only be a reality if journalism really begins to serve the majority, which are usually also the underprivileged. As long as journalism is serving the few, it cannot be that then we expect our communities, we cannot expect our young people to fight for us when they don't see themselves in our stories. We cannot expect our women to be part of saying, wait, how do we make sure that that newspaper doesn't close down, when only less than 30% of the voices that are sourced in the news are women. So we need to rethink, and this is what the toolkit, the guide is about. It's about in the area of elections, but really in so many topics. How do we move towards being more inclusive? How do we really take up our position as media, as the fourth estate, so that in a way that's part of our sustainability model, that communities feel part of what we do, and the journey to fighting for and saving our media is not just it's not just the responsibility of the media house, because we know that the media house are failing because it's so hard to be financially sustainable. So part of what we need to do, and part of our sustainability, financial sustainability, is in the role that we play and how people understand it and how people interact with the work that we do. And this guide is really one of the main reasons we are so proud of it, is really a way moving us forward to that, to a more sustainable media, to a media that tells nuanced stories. I think Zoe started by saying that, there's often simplification, oversimplification of these issues, but that's not what we want. So we really hope that you will interact with the guide. Again, the link is in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us. I do want to I would have loved to have a chance to give the people who helped build this up, the people we had focus groups on. I would have loved to give one or two people a chance to just share their feelings, share their thoughts and their experiences. And I've seen some of them in the chat group. Unfortunately, because of time, we cannot do that. But I want to once again, on behalf of Africa No Filter and on behalf of Frey College, I want to thank you so much for giving of your time. Everybody who's here, the journalists, the people from civil society, everyone who's here, you made your time to be here. Thank you so much. This is really a call on all of us as we go forward. Are we going to stand up in our newsrooms and say, let's do things differently this year? Let's talk to different people. Let's really rethink our role in journalism as we go forth. With that, again, I thank you so much for joining us. We'll end it there. Please have a lovely week and download the guide. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I didn't know Mama Ponya was a woman.